Herminio, you just want to hear the stinger. The bam, bam, bam. To be honest, that's all I want to hear as well. That's right, everybody. It's time for another Marvel in the 90s. Today we're going to be talking about Avengers X-Men Bloodties. This was basically a sequel that happened right after Fatal Attractions. But it's also a little bit of a sequel to X-Men Extinction Agenda. In this book, it starts off with the Avengers being told by S.H.I.E.L.D. and the UN, because at this point, both the West Coast Avengers and the Avengers were sanctioned by the UN. They're told by the UN and S.H.I.E.L.D., don't involve yourself in the civil war going on in Genosha. So Genosha, and what happened in the Extinction Agenda and what happened after that, was basically, you find out that there's this island off the eastern coast of Africa, right? And they have this slave race of mutates. They're kind of related to mutants in a way, not exactly mutants if I remember correctly, but the idea was that they had this genetically engineered slave race. The X-Men found out, exposed it, and now since then there's been this civil war brewing. Now the Avengers are never a part of it. And yes, mullets everywhere. Look at that. And that's the Avengers as they were back in the, what was this, 93. And it was 1993 because this was the 30-year anniversary of the X-Men and the Avengers. And they brought them together. Now these teams hadn't been brought together too many times during their franchise histories. In the times they were brought together, they were kind of adversarial against each other. Now in this one, they pretty much spend the entire book on their own. And then at the very end, they come together. And it's actually really, really cool. But there's the 90s era Avengers team. You got the West Coast there. You got War Machine. There's no Iron Man, but there's War Machine. There's Crystal down there in the bottom right-hand corner. She's very, very important because Cortez has kidnapped her and Quicksilver's daughter. Now, Quicksilver and did I say Scarlet? Crystal, the Inhuman, and Quicksilver, the mutant, Magneto's son. Their daughter, Luna, has been kidnapped by Fabian Cortez, taken to Genosha, and he is stoking the flames of the civil war between the mutates and the upper ruling human class. Some really interesting social commentaries going on in here. It's written by a whole bunch of people. It crosses over between Avengers, Avengers West Coast, X-Men, and Uncanny X-Men. But basically, the whole plot is that the Avengers and the X-Men go after Luna, the granddaughter of Magneto, who's been kidnapped by Fabian Cortez. This is right after Fatal Attractions, if you remember. Meanwhile, the UN decides to send Professor Xavier, and he tags along with the Beast, Hank McCoy, U.S. Agent, and Henry Gyrick. And they go over there to have their own mission. And then, of course, the X-Men go, the Avengers go, and then they go. So you have these three factions, and throughout the book, they're kind of doing their own thing. But then they come together. One of my favorite things about this era of the Avengers is straight up the stupid leather jackets. Everybody had to wear one in the 90s. But it's a really great moment. You're reading this book, and it seems kind of like dull a little bit at times. Like, I just want these teams to meet up. But they do. And they work together, even though they kind of got a little bit of a shady past with each other. When they finally meet up, you got Cersei right there. Cersei is an Eternal. You're eventually going to see her in that Eternals movie coming up. But it turns out, and by the way, I do want to point out that War Machine, who's one of my favorite characters at Marvel, does nothing but just get his ass kicked in this entire movie. At one point, he gets his ass kicked of his own volition. Absolutely. Yeah. Cap's Anatomy. Yeah, look at that. And everybody wants to holler at Rob Liefeld? No, that was just the 90s. And it was definitely Marvel in the 90s. Anyway, Cersei's pretty badass. War Machine's getting his ass kicked left and right, even by thin air. And then it turns out that Exodus gets involved because Exodus is, of course, now the voice of Magneto. At the end of Fatal Attractions, Magneto was mind-wiped by Xavier, who was still rocking the stubble, rocking the emo, broody, angel-type atmosphere. And he's over there. Genosha's just a powder keg waiting to explode. And, of course, since they told the Avengers not to show up, of course they got to. But it's kind of shady because Fury knows that Luna, Crystal's daughter, has been kidnapped. In fact, they actually have a crystal there, and it's some kind of weird demon or something. Really unclear. My favorite art in this entire run is the John Romita Jr., who did the Uncanny X-Men issue. This is a really badass psionic fight and battle between Exodus and Cersei. Now, at this time, they're really trying to prove and build up Exodus. Exodus is badass. He's an Omega-level mutant. At this time, we didn't really know too much about him. He briefly showed up in Fatal Attractions, and they keep alluding to all this other mystery. There's a great shot right there of the Avengers and the X-Men teaming up against this. Everybody gets together. Even Xavier and Beast are there now. And yeah, Black Knight, not always my favorite Avenger, but at this time, he was an important character to the Avengers, and he's very important to the end of the story. So Exodus shows up. He winds up actually being the villain because he shows up and kills Fabian. I believe Fabian stayed dead for a little bit, but not for too long. So Exodus shows up, he kills Fabian, and now he's the one, and he's about to completely destroy Genosha unless all the mutates rise up and kill all the humans. He's trying to fan the flames of the Civil War, doing what's right with Magneto, and then it takes a distraction, a psionic attack, pretty much like the one that mind-wiped Magneto, Xavier uses on Exodus, but it doesn't work. But it was all a distraction because Black Knight just stabs him with his sword, and then the story's pretty much over. That's X-Men, Avengers, Bloodties, and one of the big things, of course, is Quicksilver and Crystal and their daughter Luna are very much central to this story. And they were estranged at that time, and this kind of brought them back together, albeit briefly. But it was really cool to have a very natural, organic reason for why the Avengers and the X-Men would be together. It wasn't just something that was forced out of nothing. And I'm not saying I don't like Avengers versus X-Men. I think that's fine. But, I mean, that the Phoenix has shown up on Earth plenty of times. Why do the Avengers care now? And it's still a piece here. Like, why do the Avengers care about Genosha? But it's because Luna's been kidnapped. There's a connection to the Avengers and to the X-Men through Quicksilver, through Crystal, through Luna, through Scarlet Witch, through Magneto. It's Magneto's granddaughter who was a human. So she gets used as a shield by Fabian and then eventually taken by Exodus. And Exodus plans on killing her because she's a human. And to him, that's an affront to the legacy of Magneto. All in all, I like this book. You got some great artwork, Steve Epting, John Romita Jr., and others. You got writers like Scott Lobdell, Fabian Nicieza, Bob Harris himself, Roy Thomas. Some really great stuff. The weakest one for me is the West Coast Avengers one, and it basically just connects a couple dots in the different scenes. I've got my original issues right here. Part 1 is in Avengers 368. Love that cover. Part 2 is in X-Men 26. This immediately was the next issue after Wolverine had his adamantium ripped out of him in Fatal Attractions. So this was really hype at the time. Big deal. There is West Coast Avengers number 101. Exodus completely kicks War Machine's ass. Just completely kicks his ass. War Machine does nothing but get his ass kicked. There's 307 Uncanny X-Men right there with some really wonderful John Romita Jr. art. The only problem is every so often he flips the damn fucking layout. I hate that shit. And then there's the final issue right there. Part 5, Avengers 369 with the foil embossed silver cover. Quicksilver and Crystal and Exodus. Love this cover. They did a gold cover eventually too. What was that for? What did the gold cover mean for? Anyway, so all in all, I think it's cool. It's not near as dope as Fatal Attractions that came right before it, or even the Extinction Agenda, which it references a shit ton. So it's kind of like a thematic sequel to that, but a direct sequel to Fatal Attractions. But it really starts building up the character of Exodus, who becomes a very powerful and important X-Men character until eventually forgotten about, and now he's back. He's back in the Jonathan Hickman books, and he's on the council, and that's important. And the reason why you know that's important is because of stories like this. You know that Hickman's referencing and respecting those stories, and I'm very excited. Exodus was a character I absolutely loved. When Toy Biz finally did the toy, which I no longer have, so I'll have to get that soon. But I loved that toy, loved the character, loved the mystery, loved the slow build-up into who he is. We still haven't even gotten his origin, and it is tied into the Black Knight, and it's referenced in this story, but I like it. It didn't feel like the Avengers and the X-Men were force-fed into something, but I had a lot of fun with it. It felt natural. It felt organic. It felt melodramatic, over-the-top, ridiculous. It sounds like Marvel in the 90s.